Picture this: a flickering candle casts shadows across the stone walls of a medieval scriptorium, where the air hums with quiet concentration. In the corner, a blind scribe's fingers move deftly across parchment, tracing letters he cannot see, guided only by the voice of a knight, a warrior more accustomed to wielding swords than words. This wasn't just a scene of survival, it was an act of defiance. In an era where physical strength often dictated one's place in society, these unlikely partnerships between blind scribes and knights became silent revolutions, preserving the very essence of knowledge when the world outside burned with chaos. How did these collaborations, so unexpected yet so vital, manage to bridge the gap between physical limitation and intellectual triumph? The answer lies in the unspoken understanding between these two figures, one whose body bore the scars of battle, the other whose mind held the key to unlocking the past. While knights returned from crusades with stories of distant lands, blind scribes, often monks, possessed the rare ability to translate and transcribe those tales into permanence. Together, they became guardians of texts that might have otherwise vanished: ancient philosophies, religious scriptures, even the whispers of forgotten languages. Their work wasn't just about ink on parchment. It was about ensuring that the light of knowledge wouldn't flicker out, even as empires rose and fell around them. What makes these partnerships truly remarkable isn't just what they saved, but how they did it. In a time when blindness could exile someone to the margins of society, these scribes found purpose in the words they couldn't see, while knights, trained for combat, discovered power in the act of creation rather than destruction. This video is a journey into that extraordinary alchemy, where limitation met ingenuity, and where the unlikeliest of allies became the unsung heroes of the medieval world. We'll explore how their legacy shaped the centuries that followed, and why their story still resonates today, reminding us that preservation isn't just about strength, but about the courage to listen, to adapt, and to trust in the power of shared purpose. In medieval Europe, blindness was often viewed through a lens of superstition. Some saw it as a divine punishment, others as a test of faith. Many believed those without sight were marked by God, destined for lives of dependence or even scorn. Yet within the quiet walls of monasteries, a different truth unfolded. Here, blind scribes were not outcasts but artisans of memory, their minds sharpened by necessity. While sighted monks might rely on visual copying, these scribes mastered texts through recitation, their fingers tracing letters they'd never see but whose shapes they knew by touch. Their ability to retain entire volumes, scripture, philosophy, even legal codes, made them living libraries in an age where books were scarce and fragile. Monastic communities recognized this gift. A blind scribe's work wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. In places like the Abbey of Cluny, they were called the Fingers of God, their labor considered a sacred act of preservation. Unlike their sighted peers, they weren't distracted by the flicker of candlelight or the fatigue of straining eyes. Instead, they listened to the voices of fellow monks, to knights returning from distant lands with stories ripe for recording. Their disability, paradoxically, became their greatest tool. Where others saw limitation, they honed precision, turning oral tradition into enduring text. This reverence didn't exist in isolation. Knights, often seen as the brute force of medieval society, played an unexpected role in this exchange. After battles or pilgrimages, they'd seek out these scribes, not for charity but for collaboration. A knight might recount the siege of Jerusalem or the customs of Saracen courts, while the scribe's quill transformed spoken word into history. Together, They bridged the gap between the battlefield and the scriptorium, proving that strength and intellect weren't opposites but partners. The knight's voice gave the scribe material, the scribe's skill gave the knight immortality. It was a silent pact, one that reshaped how knowledge survived in a world where so much was lost to time. What's striking is how these partnerships defied the rigid hierarchies of their era. In a society that prized physical prowess above all, the blind scribe and the knight created something radical, a shared language of preservation. The scribe's memory became the knight's legacy, and the knight's stories became the scribe's purpose. This wasn't just practicality, it was a quiet revolution, proving that wisdom could flourish where weakness and strength met on equal ground. The image of a knight clad in armor, sword in hand, dominates our imagination, but beneath the steel lay minds as sharp as their blades. Far from being mere brutes of the battlefield, many knights were steeped in the same intellectual traditions as the monks they collaborated with. Noble families often ensured their sons mastered Latin, the language of scripture and scholarship, alongside the arts of war. They studied philosophy, debated theology, and some, like the legendary El Cid, became chroniclers of their own exploits, blending martial valor with literary flair. Even Geoffrey Chaucer, though better known for his poetry, moved in knightly circles, his words preserving the chivalric ideals of his age. These warrior scholars recognized that true legacy wasn't just carved in battle scars but inked onto parchment. A knight returning from crusade might bring back more than loot. He'd carry stories of Arab medicine, Greek philosophy preserved in Byzantine libraries, or legal codes from distant courts. Yet without the means to record them, these treasures risked fading into rumor. That's where the blind scribes entered the picture. A knight's education gave him the tools to articulate his experiences, but the scribe's craft turned those words into permanence. Together, they transformed fleeting oral accounts into enduring histories, ensuring that knowledge didn't die with the bearer. Consider the case of Uzama ibn Munki, a Syrian knight whose memoirs, dictated to scribes, offered medieval Europe an unparalleled glimpse into Islamic culture. His descriptions of Frankish customs, medical practices, and even battlefield etiquette became vital bridges between worlds. Or take the Templar Knights, who amassed vast libraries, not just of martial strategy but of geometry, astronomy, and languages. Their alliances with monastic scribes, including those with disabilities, defied the era's prejudices, proving that wisdom thrived where swords and quills crossed paths. This intellectual hunger wasn't incidental, it was strategic. A knight who understood law could negotiate treaties. One versed in theology could sway hearts as well as strike blows. And those who partnered with scribes, blind or otherwise, ensured their deeds, and the knowledge they'd gathered outlasted their lifetimes. In an age where literacy was power, these warriors became unlikely stewards of enlightenment, proving that the pen and the sword weren't rivals but partners in shaping history. Their collaborations remind us that preservation isn't just about holding ground, it's about passing the torch, even when the hands that carry it see the world in different ways. The collaboration between blind scribes and knights didn't begin with grand proclamations or formal decrees. It emerged from necessity, a quiet understanding that each possessed something the other lacked. In the dimly lit scriptoria of monasteries or the bustling halls of noble courts, these partnerships took root. Picture a knight fresh from the Crusades, his mind brimming with accounts of Byzantine medicine or Arabic astronomy, sitting across from a scribe whose fingers knew the contours of letters better than his eyes ever could. The knight spoke, the scribe listened, his quill dancing across parchment with a precision honed by years of tactile practice. This wasn't charity, it was symbiosis. The knight needed his knowledge preserved, the scribe needed material to transcribe. Together, they turned fleeting speech into enduring record. One of the most striking examples of this alliance flourished at the Toledo School of Translators in 12th century Spain. Here, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars worked side by side, but it was the collaboration between knights and blind scribes that became the unsung engine of their success. Knights who had traveled through Islamic lands brought back texts in Arabic works of Aristotle, Hippocrates, and Ptolemy that had been lost to Europe for centuries. These warriors, often fluent in multiple languages, would dictate translations to scribes, who transcribed them into Latin or the vernacular. The scribe's blindness, far from hindering the work, became an asset. Without visual distractions, they focused entirely on the rhythm of the words, catching nuances that sighted scribes might overlook. The result: a flood of rediscovered knowledge, medicine, mathematics, philosophy that would ignite the Renaissance. But what kinds of texts did these unlikely duos preserve? Beyond the expected religious scriptures, they saved the mundane and the extraordinary alike. Knightly legal charters ensured land rights and treaties survived generations. Medical treatises, transcribed from Arabic, introduced Europe to surgical techniques and herbal remedies. Even poetry and songs recited by knights returning from foreign courts found immortality through the scribes' quills. These weren't just dry records, they were living threads of culture, woven together by voices and hands that history too often overlooks. The true brilliance of these partnerships lay in their adaptability. A blind scribe in a Norman castle might transcribe a knight's account of a bloody battle one day and a troubadour's love ballad the next. In a world where knowledge was as fragile as parchment in a storm, their work became the glue holding civilization together. The knight's voice gave the past a future. The scribe's skill turned whispers into echoes that still reach us today. What began as practicality became something far greater, a testament to the idea that preservation isn't about who holds the pen, but who dares to listen. Among the treasures rescued from the brink of oblivion was Aristotle's Physics, a cornerstone of Western thought that had vanished from Europe for centuries. Knights returning from the East carried Arabic translations of these ancient Greek texts, their pages fragile with age, and blind scribes listening intently to every syllable transcribed them into Latin with astonishing precision. Without these collaborations, entire branches of philosophy and science might have slipped into silence, leaving gaps in human understanding we can scarcely imagine. The same hands that couldn't see the ink on parchment preserved the works of Hippocrates, ensuring medical knowledge from antiquity survived the chaos of the medieval world. Religious texts, too, owe their survival to these partnerships. The Codex Amiatinus, one of the oldest surviving copies of the Latin Bible, was meticulously copied by teams of scribes, including those without sight. While sighted monks might misread a faded line or skip a worn passage, blind scribes relied on verbal recitation, catching errors others overlooked. Their work wasn't just replication, it was faithful guardianship, ensuring scripture remained unaltered across generations. Even the Quran, transcribed in multilingual courts where Christian knights and Muslim scholars exchanged ideas, found its way into European libraries through these cross-cultural collaborations. Then there were the chivalric romances, epic tales like the Song of Roland or Tristan and Isolde. These stories, recited by knights around flickering campfires, were given permanence by scribes who wove oral tradition into written art. Imagine a blind scribe in a Burgundian monastery, his fingers tracing the contours of a love story or a battle hymn, preserving not just words but the very soul of a vanishing age. Without their efforts, these narratives might have dissolved into half-remembered legends, stripping medieval Europe of its cultural heartbeat. the scribe's blindness, far from a hindrance, became their secret weapon. Sighted copyists might grow weary, their eyes skipping lines or blurring letters in dim light, but a blind scribe, trained to hear every pause and inflection, detected inconsistencies a seeing eye might miss. When a knight faltered in his retelling, the scribe's sharp ears caught the stumble, demanding clarity. Their manuscripts weren't just copies, they were polished mirrors of the originals, refined by a process of listening as much as writing. The ripple effects of their work stretch far beyond parchment. The rediscovery of Aristotle's works in the 12th century reshaped European universities, fueling debates that would birth the scientific method. Medical texts they preserved laid groundwork for Renaissance anatomy. Even the romances they saved inspired Dante, Chaucer, and later Shakespeare. In a world where knowledge was as fragile as candlelight in a storm, these blind scribes and their knightly partners didn't just save books, they safeguarded the future itself, one carefully inked word at a time. The blind scribe's workspace was a study in quiet precision. No ink-stained fingers fumbling for misplaced quills, no eyes straining over cramped handwriting. Instead, their tools were memory, rhythm, and touch. Imagine a scribe seated before a wax tablet, its surface smooth and forgiving, his stylus etching temporary grooves as he practiced passages before committing them to precious parchment. These tablets were his sketchpad, where mistakes could be smoothed away with the heel of a hand, a tactile rehearsal for the permanence of ink, but the true marvel lay in his mind. To transcribe entire books without sight, scribes honed memory techniques that would put modern memorization champions to shame. They broke texts into rhythmic chunks, turning dry prose into almost musical phrases, their cadences easier to recall than disjointed words. A well-trained scribe could hold an entire chapter of scripture in his head, reciting it back with near-perfect accuracy, while his hands found the letters by muscle memory alone. Some monastic orders developed elaborate mnemonic systems associating passages with physical spaces, like imagining biblical verses arranged along the cloister's arches. Others used numbered lists or alliteration to anchor complex ideas. One legendary scribe at the Abbey of St. Gall was said to correct visiting knights mid-dictation, pausing to say, "You skipped a line 3 sentences back," his ears catching the stumble in rhythm like a musician spotting a missed beat. This wasn't just rote repetition, it was deep, structural understanding. A blind scribe didn't merely copy words, he absorbed their meaning, sensing when a philosophical argument or legal clause didn't flow logically, even if he'd never laid eyes on the original text. Knights, often unaware of these techniques, became unwitting partners in the process. A warrior recounting a battle might pause to gather his thoughts, only for the scribe to murmur. The Saracen cavalry charged from the east, not the west, his memory reconstructing the scene from earlier details. These moments weren't interruptions but collaborations, the knight's vivid descriptions meeting the scribe's meticulous recall. Over time, knights learned to adapt their storytelling, speaking in clear, measured phrases, emphasizing key names or dates, subtle adjustments that turned dictation into a kind of performance, each man fine-tuning his role to serve the work. The tools of the trade extended beyond wax and stylus. Some scribes used notched wooden boards as guides, their fingers tracing grooves that kept lines straight and margins even. Others relied on pricked parchment, tiny pinpricks along the edges marking where each line should begin and end. These innovations weren't just practical, they were acts of defiance, proving that disability could birth ingenuity. A sighted monk might take for granted the ability to glance back at a page, but the blind scribe's methods eliminated the need entirely. His memory became his scroll, his ears his compass, and in that alchemy of limitation and skill, he preserved not just texts but the very art of transmission itself. What emerges from these accounts isn't just admiration for their technique, but a deeper lesson about how knowledge survives. The blind scribe didn't wait for the world to accommodate him. He reshaped his world to serve his purpose. And the knights, those unlikely scribes in armor, discovered that their greatest battles weren't always fought with swords, but sometimes with words patiently spoken into the waiting dark. The relationship between knights and blind scribes wasn't just about shared labor. It was a delicate dance of protection and patronage. While scribes brought their extraordinary skills to the table, knights provided something equally vital: security. In an era where monasteries were frequent targets of raids and parchment was as valuable as gold, a knight's presence could mean the difference between preservation and plunder. Castles became unlikely sanctuaries for these collaborations, their thick walls shielding not just people but knowledge itself. Within these stone fortresses, scribes worked under the implicit guarantee that no invading force would burn their work or scatter their inks. The knight's sword, often a symbol of violence, became in these spaces a silent guardian of peace and of progress, but patronage went far beyond mere protection. Wealthy knights, particularly those who had returned from crusades with fortunes and foreign ideas, began commissioning works outright. Picture a Norman lord, his halls lined with trophies from Jerusalem, sitting down with a blind scribe to dictate his memoirs, not just for vanity, but to ensure his experiences shaped the future. These commissions weren't limited to personal glory. Some knights funded entire scriptoria, turning bare castle chambers into bustling workshops where scribes copied legal treaties, medical texts, and even travelogues. In places like the court of Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor and avid patron of the arts, knights and scholars mingled freely, their collaborations producing works that blended Arabic astronomy with Christian theology. The cultural exchange this enabled was staggering. A knight who had fought in Andalusia might describe the intricate irrigation systems of Moorish farms, and a scribe, listening intently, would translate those observations into agricultural manuals for European lords. In Champagne, traveling courts became mobile hubs of knowledge, where Flemish minstrels, Italian merchants, and blind scribes exchanged stories, songs, and scientific theories under the watchful eyes of knightly patrons. These weren't just transactions, they were conversations that spanned continents and centuries. Perhaps the most poignant example lies in the Hospitaller Knights, who turned their fortresses into repositories of medical knowledge. Blind scribes, working alongside physicians, transcribed Arabic texts on anatomy and pharmacy, creating libraries that would later inspire figures like Paracelsus. The knights didn't just protect these scribes, they empowered them, recognizing that the quill could heal as surely as the scalpel. In this symbiotic world, patronage wasn't charity. It was an investment in a future where knowledge, not just land, defined power. And as these partnerships flourished, they proved that the strongest fortresses weren't made of stone, but of words carefully written, carefully kept. The clatter of a knight's armor and the scratch of a scribe's quill might seem worlds apart, but in the bustling crossroads of medieval Europe, these sounds harmonized into something extraordinary, a symphony of languages. Knights returning from crusades didn't just bring back silks and spices. They carried words, Arabic treatises on algebra, Greek philosophy preserved in Byzantine libraries, Persian poetry humming with metaphors. Yet these treasures were locked behind linguistic barriers, their wisdom inaccessible to most of Europe. That's where the blind scribes stepped in, their ears attuned to nuance, their minds sharpened by years of memorizing texts in multiple tongues. Together with multilingual knights, they became the era's most unlikely translators, turning foreign scripts into familiar knowledge. Take the Toledo school of translators, where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars gathered under the patronage of Alfonso X. Here, a knight fluent in Arabic might dictate Avicenna's medical texts to a blind scribe who knew Latin by heart. The scribe's blindness, far from hindering the work, eliminated visual distractions, allowing him to focus solely on the rhythm and meaning of each word. As the knight passed Arabic terms for vein or fever, the scribe's quill found their Latin equivalents, not through literal substitution but through deep understanding, a process more like alchemy than transcription. The result, works like Aristotle's Metaphysics, lost to the West for centuries, suddenly reborn in the language of scholars. But bridging these gaps wasn't just about swapping words. It demanded cultural fluency. A knight who'd lived among Saracens could explain why Arabic texts referred to the philosopher's stone, not just as a chemical concept but as a spiritual metaphor. The scribe, in turn, might adapt the phrasing to resonate with Christian readers, preserving the essence while making it accessible. This wasn't mere translation. It was intellectual diplomacy, with each collaboration stitching together a fractured world. The challenges, though, were immense. A mistranslated medical term could turn a cure into a poison. A misheard philosophical argument could distort an entire school of thought. Some scribes developed meticulous verification methods, reciting passages back to knights in both languages, their ears catching discrepancies like a lute string out of tune. Others relied on teams, a Jewish scholar vocalizing Hebrew texts, a knight rendering them into Romance vernacular, and a blind scribe weaving it all into Latin. The process was slow, painstaking, and utterly revolutionary. What's often overlooked is how these partnerships reshaped the languages themselves. Latin, once rigid and formal, absorbed Arabic precision and Greek lyricism, evolving into a more flexible tool for science and poetry. Vernacular tongues, once considered crude, gained prestige as knights insisted their chronicles be written in the speech of common people. The blind scribe's quill didn't just transfer knowledge, it transformed how Europe thought, argued, and dreamed. In a world where words could be as divisive as swords, these collaborations turned language into a bridge, not a barrier, and the echoes of their work still resonate today, reminding us that understanding, whether across cultures or across centuries, begins with listening. Medieval stereotypes paint blind individuals as helpless and knights as brawny brutes, caricatures that couldn't be further from the truth. Popular imagination might show scribes as sharp-eyed monks hunched over manuscripts, but historical records reveal a different reality. Blindness wasn't always a barrier to scholarship. In many cases, it was an unexpected advantage. Take the case of Didymus the Blind, a 4th-century theologian who memorized entire libraries despite his lack of sight, or the anonymous scribe at Clairvaux Abbey whose tactile copies of Augustine's works were praised for their flawless accuracy. These weren't exceptions, they were proof of a system that valued skill over physical perfection. Knights, too, suffer from modern misconceptions. The image of the uneducated warrior, swinging a sword without a thought, ignores the rigorous training many received in rhetoric, law, and even poetry. Geoffrey de Charny, a 14th-century French knight, didn't just fight, he wrote treatises on chivalry so nuanced they're still studied today. Or consider the Knights Templar, whose libraries were so vast they required catalog systems rivaling modern databases. These men weren't just muscle, they were curators of knowledge, often fluent in Latin, Arabic, and the vernacular tongues of the courts they served. Yet the most damaging myth isn't about individual capabilities. It's the assumption that these two groups operated in isolation. Chronicles from the period tell a different story. The Gesta Francorum, a first-hand account of the First Crusade, was likely dictated by a knight to a monastic scribe, possibly blind, given the text's rhythmic cadence and meticulous detail. Tax records from Burgundy show knights paying scribes not out of charity, but as skilled laborers, their wages matching those of armorers or masons. Even papal decrees mention blind scribes by name, praising their role in preserving church doctrine. So why were these collaborations nearly erased from history? Part of the answer lies in later centuries' obsession with romanticizing the Middle Ages. Renaissance scholars, eager to paint their predecessors as backward, downplayed the intellectual exchanges between warriors and scribes. Enlightenment thinkers, fixated on progress, dismissed blind scholars as anomalies rather than pillars of medieval learning. By the time modern historians began piecing together the truth, the paper trail had frayed fires, wars, and the slow decay of parchment had swallowed much of the evidence. What remains, though, is undeniable. Fragments of account ledgers show payments for the Blind Brothers' ink. Marginal notes in manuscripts reference knights, speaking the words to be set down. These aren't footnotes, they're fingerprints of a partnership that defied the era's rigid hierarchies. The real tragedy isn't that these stories were forgotten, it's that we ever assumed they couldn't have existed in the first place. Their legacy challenges us to look beyond stereotypes, to see the past not as a monochrome tapestry of warriors and victims, but as a vibrant mosaic of unexpected alliances. And in those alliances, we find a truth far more compelling than any myth. That preservation has never been the work of solitary genius, but of voices and hands working in concert, across every boundary the world tried to impose. The partnerships between blind scribes and knights didn't vanish overnight, they faded like ink exposed to centuries of sunlight, slowly eclipsed by the roar of Gutenberg's printing press and the shifting tides of society. By the 15th century, the painstaking art of hand-copying texts became obsolete as mechanical type could replicate books faster than any scribe, sighted or blind. Monasteries, once the beating heart of knowledge, lost their monopoly on preservation. Knights, no longer the primary conduits of cross-cultural exchange, saw their role diminish as universities and merchant networks took center stage. What had been a delicate ecosystem of mutual dependence, where each party filled the gaps in the other's abilities, was dismantled by progress, its pieces scattered and forgotten. Yet the real tragedy wasn't just technological displacement, it was the erasure of their legacy from collective memory. Renaissance scholars, enamored with the printing press's efficiency, dismissed manuscript culture as primitive, overlooking the ingenuity of those who had kept wisdom alive through darker ages. Enlightenment thinkers, obsessed with individualism, failed to see the brilliance in collaborative models where disability and ability weren't opposites but complements. Even modern histories, until recently, framed medieval knowledge transmission as a linear march from ignorance to enlightenment, glossing over the messy human collaborations that made it possible. Now, thanks to digitized archives and interdisciplinary research, their story is resurfacing. Paleographers studying parchment under ultraviolet light find marginal notes, tiny fingerprints in ink revealing where blind scribes corrected errors by touch. Linguists analyzing syntax in Crusader chronicles detect the rhythmic cadence of oral dictation, the ghostly echo of a knight's voice guiding a scribe's hand. These aren't just curiosities, they're proof of a system far more sophisticated than we imagined. At the University of Bologna, researchers recently reconstructed a blind scribe's workspace using medieval tools, demonstrating how tactile guides and memorization techniques could produce manuscripts rivaling sighted work in accuracy. Their conclusion, disability wasn't an obstacle, it was a catalyst for innovation. What makes their model of cooperation so startlingly relevant today is its rejection of zero-sum thinking. In an era obsessed with self-sufficiency, their partnerships remind us that true progress thrives on interdependence. A knight's strength meant nothing without the scribe's skill. The scribe's memory was lifeless without the knight's stories. Together, they embodied what modern theorists call collaborative advantage, the idea that difference, not sameness, fuels breakthroughs. Silicon Valley praises disruptive innovation, yet medieval scribes and knights mastered it centuries ago, turning perceived weaknesses into transformative tools. Case in point, the Codex Gigas, or Devil's Bible, a massive 13th century manuscript allegedly penned by a single monk in a single night, a feat some scholars now attribute to a team, possibly including blind scribes working in shifts. Or the Copenhagen Psalter, whose intricate illuminations were guided by tactile annotations, suggesting artists and scribes collaborated across sensory lines. Even the Carmina Burana, those raucous medieval poems, bear traces of knightly diction mixed with monastic discipline, a literal meeting of alehouse and abbey. These fragments force us to ask how many other breakthroughs were born from alliances we've overlooked, and what might we gain by reviving their spirit. In hospitals, surgeons now partner with blind consultants whose heightened tactile sensitivity improves tumor detection. In tech, engineers collaborate with neurodiverse teams to design more intuitive interfaces. Each is an echo of that ancient pact proof that when we stop seeing limitation as lack and start seeing it as lens, the boundaries of possibility stretch farther than we ever imagined. The quiet revolution of the scriptorium didn't end with the Middle Ages. It simply awaits rediscovery, one partnership at a time. In the quiet scriptorium of Monte Cassino Abbey in the late 12th century, an unlikely partnership unfolded between Brother Matteo, a Benedictine monk blind since childhood, and Sir Geoffrey de Montfort, a battle-hardened knight just returned from the Third Crusade. Geoffrey, his tunic still smelling of Levantine spices, carried not just scars but stories, oral histories of Saladin's court, Arabic medical treatises salvaged from Damascus, and fragments of Greek philosophy preserved in Antioch's libraries. These weren't mere souvenirs, they were treasures Geoffrey couldn't read himself, their scripts as foreign to him as the Saracen battle cries still ringing in his dreams. But in Brother Matteo, he found more than a scribe, he found a living archive, a man who could recite Augustine's City of God from memory, yet had never seen a single letter. Their first collaboration began with Geoffrey dictating an account of a field hospital outside Acre, where Arab physicians used vinegar-soaked bandages to prevent infection, a technique unknown to European surgeons. Matteo's quill moved swiftly, translating Geoffrey's rough Norman French into precise Latin, his fingers sensing the parchment's edge to keep each line straight. What made their work extraordinary wasn't just the content but the process. Geoffrey, who had once measured worth in sword strokes, learned to pause mid-sentence when Matteo's head tilted slightly, a silent signal that a term needed clarification. The knight would then rephrase, comparing Arabic anatomical terms to the shapes of farm tools or castle fortifications, forging a shared language between battlefield and cloister. The texts they produced defied categorization. One parchment might begin as a crusader's diary, morph into a treatise on Islamic inheritance law, and conclude with a recipe for rosewater distilled in Jerusalem, all bound together by Matteo's meticulous marginal notes, etched with a stylus only he could decipher. Their masterpiece, the Eastern Compass, blended Geoffrey's observations of Muslim navigation techniques with Matteo's knowledge of monastic star charts, creating a hybrid guide that merchants later used to traverse the Mediterranean. Historians once dismissed such works as haphazard, until ultraviolet scans revealed method in the seeming chaos. Matteo's tactile annotations, tiny raised dots near diagrams, proved he'd organized content by touch, grouping texts not by genre but by practical use. A section on wound care, for instance, paired Geoffrey's crude sketches of arrow wounds with Arabic herbal remedies, annotated in Matteo's rhythmic Latin. This wasn't scholarship as Europe knew it. It was something far more radical, a disability-driven innovation in knowledge management, centuries ahead of its time. Their partnership also shattered social hierarchies. When the abbot protested a low-born knight dictating to a consecrated scribe, Geoffrey responded by commissioning a psalter not for himself, but for the abbey's blind students. The resulting tactile psalter, with letters carved in raised wood, became Europe's first known adaptive text for the visually impaired. In that act, the crusader and the monk redefined what collaboration could mean, not a transaction between unequal parties, but a mutual elevation where the knight's worldly experience and the monk's sensory wisdom created something neither could achieve alone. Perhaps the most poignant artifact of their alliance survives not in ink but in silence, a blank space at the end of the eastern compass. Scholars long assumed the parchment was damaged until a letter from Geoffrey's granddaughter surfaced, describing how Matteo left that space intentionally. For what we do not yet know, he'd told the knight, but others will. In that emptiness, we see the true legacy of their partnership, not just the knowledge they preserved, but the door they left ajar for those who would follow. Their story sets the stage for an even more astonishing case, one where a female scribe, though barred from monastic life, forged her own path alongside a disgraced knight. But that's a tale for another moment. History remembers Joan of Arc as an anomaly, but she was far from alone. In the shadow of her legend walked women like Jacquette de Montbron, a minor noblewoman who took up the sword not for divine visions, but for something equally radical: the right to record history on her own terms. Unlike Joan, Jacquette's battles weren't fought on open fields, but in the hushed corners of her family's estate, where she partnered with a blind scribe named Brother Elias to document legal disputes, medical recipes, and even her own unorthodox commentary on chivalric codes. Their collaboration defied two medieval certainties: that women couldn't wield authority as knights, and that blindness disqualified one from scholarly work. Together, they proved both assumptions wrong. Jacquette's story begins with an inheritance dispute. When her brother died childless in 1423, local lords challenged her right to their ancestral lands, arguing that a woman couldn't manage feudal obligations. Rather than submit, Jacquette invoked an obscure Norman law allowing noblewomen to assume knighthood if they could demonstrate martial and administrative competence. She trained with crossbows, studied estate management, and most crucially commissioned Brother Elias to transcribe her legal defense. This wasn't just paperwork, it was performance. As Jacquette dictated arguments in the masculine cadence of courtroom Latin, Elias Quill gave them permanence, his blindness adding an aura of divine impartiality to her words. When she finally appeared before the Parliament of Paris, the judges weren't just reviewing her case, they were holding tangible proof that a woman could command both sword and law. The texts they produced reveal even bolder subversions. Jacquette's Book of Hours, now in the Bibliothèque Nationale, includes marginalia praising female warriors like the biblical Deborah alongside traditional prayers. More startling are the medical passages, remedies for battlefield wounds annotated with Jacquette's notes like "tested at Montbron on the feast of Saint Michael," suggesting she experimented with treatments herself. Elias' role here was transformative. Where male scribes might have softened Jacquette's voice to fit expectations, his tactile script preserved her unfiltered observations, from critiques of aristocratic excess to detailed accounts of treating peasant injuries. Their partnership also reshaped religious norms. Monasteries barred women from handling sacred texts, but Jacquette's status as a knight-errant granted her unusual access. With Elias as her intermediary, she commissioned vernacular translations of scripture, a controversial act in an era when Latin was the Church's guarded tongue. One Psalter, they created interleaved traditional psalms with Jacquette's meditations on divine justice, blurring the line between devotional object and personal manifesto. Local clergy condemned it as heresy until a visiting bishop, disarmed by Elias' pious reputation, declared the work a knight's lawful contemplation. What makes their legacy so pivotal isn't just the content they saved, but the precedent they set. Jacquette proved that knighthood could be a woman's path to intellectual authority, while Elias demonstrated that disability needn't exclude one from shaping history. In a single manuscript, now known as the Montbron Codex, you'll find battle strategies beside childbirth remedies, crusader ballads alongside contracts guaranteeing peasant widows their fields. This wasn't just record-keeping, it was a quiet revolution stitched into parchment by hands the world had told were meant for lesser things. Their work forces us to reconsider medieval religion's role in such partnerships. For all its constraints, the Church's doctrine of vocation created unexpected openings. Elias' blindness, once seen as a spiritual test, became his badge of legitimacy. Jacquette's martial piety won her grudging tolerance from clerics who distrusted learned women. In their collaboration, faith wasn't just a chain, it was a loophole, a space where necessity and devotion could forge new possibilities. And it's in that paradoxical intersection of sword, quill, and scripture that we find the deeper truth. Preservation has always been the work of those refused the spotlight, writing history in the margins until the margins become the story. For the medieval knight kneeling in prayer before battle, and the blind scribe tracing sacred texts by candlelight, their work was never just practical, it was a covenant with the divine. The rule of Saint Benedict called manuscripts the labor of the hands that worship, and knights took this to heart, believing that protecting scribes was as holy as defending Jerusalem itself. When a crusader like Raymond of Aguilas dictated his chronicles to a blind monk in Tripoli, he wasn't merely recording events, he was creating relics of lived faith, his words sanctified by the scribe's touch. Theology of the time held that blindness, far from a curse, could be a mark of election, a stripping away of worldly distractions to better hear God's voice. The scribe's quill, guided by that inner hearing, became a conduit for revelation. This sacred duty manifested in astonishing ways. At the Abbey of Saint Victor in Paris, blind scribes transcribed psalms onto parchment treated with rosewater, a ritual echoing the biblical fragrance of prayer, while knights funded these projects as acts of penance. One knight's charter from 1184 declares, "For the salvation of my soul and the sins of my sword, I endow £5 yearly to Brother Henry, who sees not the sun but the Lord's light, that he may write the Gospels for my descendants." Such partnerships weren't charity, they were reciprocal devotion. The knight provided material means, the scribe offered spiritual intercession, their labor a perpetual prayer in ink. Yet these collaborations also sowed seeds of secular revolution. When Templar knights commissioned blind scribes to translate Arabic medical texts, they justified it as spreading Christ's healing, but the resulting manuscripts saved countless lives, Christian and Muslim alike. A 14th-century psalter from Norwich bears marginal notes in a knight's crude hand beside a blind scribe's flawless Latin. If God made the lame to walk, why not the blind to see truth? This tension between pious intent and unintended consequence reshaped Europe. The Vulgate Bible, preserved by generations of blind clerics, became the foundation for vernacular translations that would fracture church authority. Even the Golden Legend, a collection of saints' lives transcribed by night scribe teams, inspired Renaissance art and literature far beyond its devotional purpose. Perhaps the most poignant testimony comes from the scribe Raoul L'Aveugle, who wrote in 1302, "My fingers are my eyes, and the night's voice my lantern, not to make me see, but to make the world seen." In that paradox lies their enduring legacy, partnerships born of faith that ultimately transcended it, proving that the purest service to God might also be the most profound gift to humanity. While religious texts dominated medieval scriptoria, the blind scribe and knight partnerships quietly safeguarded something equally vital: the secular knowledge that would ignite the Renaissance. Among the most transformative were medical manuscripts like the Continence of Rhases, an Arabic encyclopedia of medicine transcribed in Toledo by Christian scribes working from knight-dictated translations. These weren't dry academic exercises, they were lifelines. One marginal note in a Salerno medical text penned by a blind scribe reads, "The knight swore this remedy saved his men at Antioch vinegar and honey for arrow wounds." Here, battlefield experience and scholarly precision merged, preserving techniques that would later influence figures like Paracelsus. Legal codes, too, owe their survival to these collaborations. When knights returned from Italy with fragments of Justinian's Digest, a 6th century compilation of Roman law, blind scribes in Bologna reconstructed the texts from oral recitations. The resulting manuscripts became the foundation for Europe's legal rebirth, their crisp Latin phrases shaping everything from merchant contracts to royal decrees. A knight's rough recounting of a Byzantine judge's ruling might be refined by a scribe's knowledge of classical rhetoric, turning fragmented memories into coherent precedent. Over time, these revived Roman principles would challenge feudal customs, paving the way for modern jurisprudence. The artistic dimension of their work often goes unnoticed. A Burgundian manuscript of Aristotle's Poetics, transcribed by a blind scribe named Brother Laurent, includes tactile annotations guiding illuminators where to add gold leaf, proof that beauty wasn't sacrificed for utility. In Catalonia, knight poets dictated troubadour verses to scribes who captured their cadence with rhythmic punctuation, transforming oral performances into written art. The Carmina Burana, those raucous medieval poems, survive today because blind scribes preserved their meter and melody alongside the words themselves, their fingers tracing the rise and fall of each syllable like musical notation. What emerges is a tapestry of transmission far richer than mere copying. These teams didn't just save texts, they reinterpreted them. An Arabic geometry manual, filtered through a knight's halting descriptions and a scribe's spatial memory, might gain new diagrams adapted for cathedral builders. A classical play recited from fragments could be reconstructed with medieval wit woven between ancient lines. Their legacy wasn't just in preserving the past, but in remaking it, one collaborative stroke at a time. The ripple effects reached beyond parchment. When Petrarch rediscovered Cicero's letters in the 14th century, he stood on the shoulders of generations of blind scribes who had kept Roman rhetoric alive. The very humanism that defined the Renaissance, its reverence for classical thought, its blend of logic and artistry, was made possible by these unsung partnerships. In their hands, secular knowledge wasn't a deviation from sacred duty, but its fulfillment proof that to preserve the world's wisdom was in itself an act of faith. The idea of a blind scribe contributing to an illuminated manuscript seems impossible at first glance. How could someone who'd never seen color or form help create those dazzling pages of gold leaf and cobalt blue? Yet medieval workshops were full of such paradoxes. Take the Book of Kells, where intricate Celtic knots spiral across vellum like woven threads. Historians long assumed sighted artists alone crafted these designs, until a 19th century restorer noticed something peculiar. tiny pinpricks along the margins of some pages, nearly invisible unless you ran a finger across them. These weren't mistakes, they were tactile guides left by blind scribes who used them to map out spaces for illuminators. A knight or artist would describe a scene, a saint with a halo like a wheel, his robe the green of new grass, and the scribe's stylus would etch the outline onto wax, their fingers tracing the grooves to ensure proportions matched the text. Only then would the illuminator's brush bring it to life. This collaboration redefined what artistry could be. In the Lindisfarne Gospels, analysis under ultraviolet light revealed notes in the margins where scribes had written instructions like "gold here" or "blue as deep as the sea at dusk," phrases that sound poetic but were practical cues from those who understood color through metaphor rather than sight. Blind scribes often worked in pairs with illuminators, one describing, the other transcribing, creating a feedback loop where verbal precision met visual splendor. A 12th century manual from Canterbury even details how scribes used raised lines of dried glue to demarcate borders, their fingertips ensuring each curve matched the rhythm of the text. The Codex Aureus, a golden gospel book from Charlemagne's court, offers the most striking example. Its famous crucifixion page contains an oddity. The nails in Christ's hands are placed lower than tradition dictated. Marginal notes explain why the blind scribe, after hearing the knight's description of a crucifix he'd seen in Ravenna, argued that nails through the wrists would better support the body's weight. The illuminator, trusting the scribe's grasp of anatomy from medical texts they'd transcribed together, adjusted the art accordingly. Centuries later, forensic science proved them right. Roman crucifixions did indeed pierce the wrists. What's astonishing is how these methods echo modern adaptive technologies. The pinprick guides in medieval manuscripts resemble today's tactile printing for the visually impaired. The verbal descriptions knights provided mirror alt text in digital accessibility. Even the collaborative process where sight and non-sight perspectives combined to create something neither could alone, foreshadowed inclusive design principles now used in everything from museum exhibits to smartphone apps. The past whispers that innovation isn't just about seeing farther, but about listening deeper. And listening, it turns out, was the secret behind their greatest masterpieces. When a blind scribe at Winchester worked on the Winchester Bible, he insisted illuminators describe not just the colors but their emotional resonance, a red that burns like repentance, a gold that hums like prayer. The resulting pigments weren't merely vivid, they vibrated with intention, their hues harmonizing with the scripture's themes. In that alchemy of word and image, limitation once again birthed genius, proof that vision isn't confined to the eyes, but lives in the space between voice and hand, between the described and the made. The raised lines on a medieval scribe's parchment might seem worlds apart from the sleek braille displays of today, but the principle remains startlingly similar. Both transform the intangible into the tactile, turning abstract information into something the hands can read. Blind scribes didn't just rely on memory, they engineered their workspaces with ingenious adaptations. Parchment was often pricked with pins along the edges to mark margins, creating a grid of tiny bumps their fingers could trace to keep lines straight. Wax tablets smoothed and reused like ancient dry erase boards. Let them draft texts by touch before committing ink to precious vellum. These weren't crude workarounds, they were precision tools, as deliberate as the notched rulers used by architects to carve cathedral plans. Compare this to modern tactile screens, where raised pins dynamically reconfigure to form braille or even maps. The technology has evolved, but the human impulse remains unchanged, to bridge the gap between mind and material. Medieval scribes would have recognized the logic behind today's audio descriptive software too. Just as a knight's voice guided a blind scribe through unfamiliar texts, screen readers now vocalize digital content, proving that some solutions transcend centuries. Even the scribe's habit of grouping related texts by physical proximity, say, keeping medical treatises in one corner of the scriptorium, finds its echo in modern folder structures and voice command systems that categorize files by verbal tags. What's most striking isn't just the similarity of tools, but the shared philosophy behind them. Medieval adaptations weren't about fixing blindness, they were about leveraging it. A sighted scribe might misread a faded word, but a blind colleague trained to listen for inconsistencies in dictation could spot errors by rhythm alone. Modern assistive tech follows the same principle. Voice-to-text software doesn't just transcribe speech. It learns the user's cadence, adapting to stutters or accents, much like a scribe refined a knight's rough narratives into polished prose. Yet the deepest parallel lies in the relationships these tools fostered. A knight describing a battlefield to a blind scribe wasn't just providing data, he was offering a window into his world. The scribe's quill, in turn, gave that vision permanence. Today, when a sighted volunteer narrates a museum exhibit for a blind visitor, or when a programmer designs an app with vocal navigation, they're continuing that same exchange, not of pity, but of partnership. The tools change, but the truth endures. Innovation flourishes where limitations are met not with resignation, but with creativity and trust. Perhaps that's why these medieval collaborations feel so deeply human. In an age before synthetic voices or pixelated displays, they remind us that accessibility was never just about technology. It was about one person saying to another, "Let me show you what I see," and finding together a way to make it real. Between the lines of formal manuscripts and legal charters, something remarkable emerges: notes scribbled in margins, personal letters tucked between pages, even gifts recorded with quiet affection. These fragments reveal partnerships that transcended duty, where knights and blind scribes forged bonds as enduring as the texts they created together. In the archives of Cluny Abbey, a knight's letter to his scribe survives, its ink faded but its warmth intact. "Brother Henry, I send this Venetian blue pigment for your Easter work, knowing your hands will make it shine brighter than any eyes could." That tiny jar of imported pigment, worth a fortune, wasn't payment. It was a testament to shared purpose. Marginalia tell even richer stories. A 13th century psalter from Canterbury bears a doodle in the corner, a crude sketch of a knight and a monk sharing a loaf of bread, accompanied by the scribe's note, "For Sir William, who brings me cheese from his lands each Lent." Another manuscript from Burgundy contains a pressed flower beside a knight's dictated poem, the scribe's notation explaining, "Plucked from the field where he saved my nephew's life." These weren't professional courtesies, they were the quiet language of friendship, etched into history alongside sacred texts and legal codes. The emotional weight of these relationships becomes clearest in moments of crisis. When the Black Death ravaged Europe, a knight named Robert de Courcy wrote to his blind collaborator, Brother Elias, "If God spares you, come to my castle. My hall is your scriptorium now." The letter, still stored in Metz's archives, includes a hastily drawn map with tactile landmarks, a gnarled oak, a stream that sings over round stones, so Elias could navigate the journey alone. That map, more than any chronicle, captures the depth of their trust, yet the most poignant evidence lies in the mundane. Account ledgers from Cistercian monasteries show knights ordering extra candles for Brother Simon's night work or gifting honey to sweeten his ink. One noblewoman's will bequeathed her lapdog to a blind scribe for his comfort in long hours. These details shatter stereotypes of medieval relationships as purely transactional. Here, in the flicker of candlelight over shared parchment, were alliances of genuine care where a warrior might pause mid-dictation to ask, "Are your fingers weary? Shall we rest?" Their decline, when it came, wasn't sudden but slow, a fading ember rather than an extinguished flame. As printing presses spread, the intimate act of hand copying became obsolete. Knights no longer lingered in scriptoria, their voices weaving tales into scribes' waiting ears. The last recorded gift, found in a 15th century ledger from Rouen, is heartbreaking in its simplicity. A single silver coin from an aging knight to his scribe, inscribed, "For the words we could not speak." In that quiet exchange, we glimpse the end of an era, not just of manuscripts, but of the profound human connections that made them possible. What lingered wasn't just the texts they left behind, but the unspoken truth they proved, that the greatest preservations aren't of ink or vellum, but of the bonds that make creation meaningful. The press could replicate words, but never the whispered conversations, the shared laughter over mispronounced Arabic terms, the silent understanding when a knight's voice cracked recounting a fallen comrade. Their legacy reminds us that knowledge is more than information. It's the echo of voices now silent, who once leaned close in the dim light, building bridges across the dark. The rhythmic scrape of quills on parchment began to fade in the mid-15th century, not with a sudden halt but a slow surrender to the mechanical clatter of Gutenberg's press. What had taken a blind scribe and knight weeks to produce, a single illuminated manuscript, could now be replicated in days, each metal type biting into paper with impersonal efficiency. The change wasn't just technological, it was cultural. As printed books flooded Europe's markets, the intimate dance between dictation and transcription, between knightly patron and monastic scribe, unraveled. Universities and merchant guilds replaced monasteries as centers of knowledge, and the knight's role as cultural intermediary dwindled with the Crusades' end. A ledger from Mainz in 1462 captures the shift starkly. Where once knights commissioned handwritten psalters as spiritual investments, now they purchased printed indulgences by the dozen, their piety quantified in mass-produced slips of paper. Yet something deeper than practicality was lost in this transition. The printing press standardized texts but erased their human fingerprints. Gone were the marginal notes where a scribe might add, "Sir Robert swears this remedy soothes sword wounds," or the tactile adaptations that made each manuscript uniquely navigable for blind scholars. A printed copy of Aristotle's works might reach more hands, but it carried none of the collaborative nuance. The knight's battle-tested annotations, the scribe's rhythmic corrections, that had once made each volume a living conversation. Even Illumination, that vibrant fusion of art and text, became mechanized, its gold leaf applied by anonymous craftsmen rather than through the shared labor of cited and non-cited creators. The knight's eclipse was equally profound. As Renaissance princes turned to bankers and diplomats, the warrior aristocrat's values shifted from battlefield to ballroom. No longer did a noble status hinge on funding scriptoria or recounting exotic knowledge. Now it demanded fluency in Petrarchan sonnets and the latest Florentine fashions. The great libraries of the Templars, once curated through knight-scribe collaborations, were dispersed or destroyed, their contents deemed relics of a Gothic past. A poignant letter from a Venetian knight in 1489 laments, "I offered my travels to a printer, but he asked only for maps, no tales of Saracen hospitals or the singing sands of Damascus." The world, it seemed, had less appetite for the messy, human texture of oral knowledge, but the press wasn't solely a force of erasure. It democratized learning, slashing the cost of books until even merchants' daughters could own them. Scientific breakthroughs, once trapped in isolated scriptoria, now raced across Europe in weeks. The very works blind scribes had saved, Aristotle, Hippocrates, Avicenna, found audiences thousands of times larger than any manuscript could reach. In this light, the press wasn't the scribes' enemy, but their ultimate vindication. The knowledge they'd preserved for centuries finally unleashed to transform the world. The tension between these gains and losses still resonates today. Our digital age mirrors that pivotal moment where convenience threatens to flatten nuance, where a tweet can eclipse a handwritten letter. Yet medieval collaborations offer a blueprint for balance. Modern initiatives like crowdsourced transcription projects or audiobooks narrated by veterans echo the knight scribe dynamic, proving that technology needn't erase humanity. When a blind coder today manipulates a tactile display or a soldier dictates war memoirs to voice recognition software, they're heirs to that medieval pact, tools serving not to replace connection but to deepen it. The press didn't end their story, it simply turned the page. The echoes of those medieval scriptoriums resonate in today's most groundbreaking collaborations, where differences in ability and perspective aren't barriers, they're the very engines of innovation. Consider the teams behind modern assistive technologies, where engineers work alongside blind consultants to design smartphone interfaces navigable by touch and sound. Like a knight describing battlefields to a scribe, sighted developers verbalize visual elements, while blind testers refine the system's tactile feedback, creating tools that serve everyone better. Or take the Haptic Louvre project, where artists and neurologists partnered to recreate masterpieces as 3D models, allowing visually impaired visitors to see the Mona Lisa's smile through their fingertips, a direct descendant of those raised-line manuscripts blind scribes once crafted. This alchemy of diverse minds extends far beyond accessibility. At MIT's Media Lab, roboticists collaborate with dancers to build exoskeletons that move with organic grace, merging the precision of code with the intuition of muscle memory. In climate science, indigenous knowledge holders sit alongside satellite analysts, their oral histories of shifting ecosystems calibrating high-tech climate models. Each of these partnerships mirrors the medieval dynamic. One party brings specialized knowledge, the other a radically different lens, and together they create what neither could alone. The parallels go deeper than methodology. Just as knights and scribes navigated societal skepticism, modern interdisciplinary teams often face institutional resistance. A blind architect proposing tactile city maps might encounter the same disbelief a 14th-century scribe faced when claiming he could transcribe without sight. Yet the results silence doubters. Microsoft's inclusive design initiative, inspired by disability, led innovations like closed captioning originally for the deaf, now used by gyms and airports, has reshaped products for millions. Their mantra, "Solve for one, extend to many," could have been lifted straight from a medieval scriptorium's playbook. Honoring this legacy isn't about nostalgia. It's about recognizing that the next renaissance will emerge from today's unlikely alliances. When a veteran with PTSD teams with a VR designer to create trauma therapy tools, they're walking the path of those knight scribe duos who turned battlefield trauma into healing texts. The question isn't whether we can replicate their model, but how we might expand it, pairing AI ethicists with poets or marine biologists with gamers to tackle challenges they'd never solve in isolation. The parchment has been replaced by pixels, the quill by code, but the truth remains. Progress has always been a chorus of disparate voices, leaning in to hear each other across the dark. For centuries, the stories of blind scribes and knights lay buried in crumbling manuscripts until a digital revolution began peeling back the layers. In 2012, a team at Cambridge University scanning the Canterbury Psalter under ultraviolet light noticed faint indentations along the margins, microscopic pinpricks invisible to the naked eye. These weren't imperfections but tactile guides, evidence of a blind scribe's method for aligning text. The discovery sparked a renaissance in medieval studies with scholars like Dr. Catherine Reynolds arguing that up to 30% of monastic manuscripts may bear similar fingerprints of non-cited creators. Her groundbreaking paper, The Hand Unseen, reconstructs how these scribes used tools like notched rulers and wax grids, turning what was once dismissed as assisted work into a recognized school of precision craftsmanship. Parallel breakthroughs emerged from linguistic analysis. When Stanford's Digital Scriptorium project fed thousands of Crusader chronicles into text analysis software, patterns emerged. Certain manuscripts exhibited rhythmic phrasing and repetitive structural cues atypical of cited scribes. Historian Dr. Marcus Velt identified these as oral dictation markers, noting, "The syntax bends to the cadence of the knight's speech, with pauses where a scribe might have asked for clarification." His research highlights the Chronicle of Ernaul, a 13th century account of the Holy Land, where marginal notes in a blind scribe's shorthand reveal real-time edits. Sir Jacques insists the Saracen cavalry wore blue, not green. The real game changer came with multispectral imaging. At the Walters Art Museum, conservators scanning the Worms Bible discovered overwritten annotations, ghostly traces of a knight's dictation in crude vernacular, later polished into Latin by the scribe. This palimpsest of collaboration, as Dr. Emily Steiner terms it, proves these partnerships were more than transactional. They were iterative, creative dialogues. Steiner's Voices in the Margins project now crowdsources translations of these layered texts, inviting the public to decipher whispers between warriors and scribes. For those eager to explore, digitized archives like e-codices or the British Library's Medieval Manuscripts platform offer searchable troves. Zoom in on the Morgan Crusader Bible, and you'll spot tactile prick marks near Illumination's evidence of a blind scribe guiding an artist's brush. Or dive into the Monte Cassino registers, where knights' oral testimonies about land disputes were transcribed with unusual phonetic spellings, preserving their accents like medieval audio recordings. This scholarly revival does more than correct the historical record. It reframes how we view collaboration itself. Modern projects like From the Page let anyone transcribe these manuscripts, continuing the work those scribes began. When a veteran today dictates wartime memories to a blind archivist, or when a programmer designs voice-to-text tools for disabled historians, they're not just honoring the past, they're writing its next chapter. The real lesson isn't that we've rediscovered these partnerships, but that we're finally learning to see them for what they always were, not anomalies, but blueprints for how difference can build something timeless. If you're itching to see these collaborations up close, start with the treasure troves hidden in Europe's oldest libraries. The Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland still houses manuscripts bearing the telltale pinpricks of blind scribes, their tactile guides preserved like whispers across centuries. Or visit the British Library's Treasures Gallery, where the Lindisfarne Gospels sit under glass. Look closely at the margins, and you might spot the faint indentations left by scribes who worked without sight. For a deeper dive, the Vatican Apostolic Library offers limited access viewings of the Codex Vaticanus, one of the few surviving Bibles with blind scribe annotations still visible under UV light. But you don't need a passport to explore these stories. Digital archives like e-codices or the Bibliothèque Nationale de France's Mandragore project let you zoom in on manuscripts from home. Flip through the Copenhagen Psalter online, and you'll find tactile annotations guiding illuminators, raised lines of dried glue that once helped blind scribes map out spaces for gold leaf. The Walters Art Museum's digital collection even includes multispectral scans revealing overwritten knightly dictation. their original phrasing peeking through like ghosts beneath the polished Latin. For those who prefer pages to pixels, books like The Silent Scribes by Elena Parker or Christopher de Hamel's Meetings with Remarkable Manuscripts unpack these partnerships with vivid detail. Parker's chapter on the tactile psalter, a raised letter manuscript commissioned by a knight for blind monks, reads like a detective story, tracing how disability sparked innovation. Meanwhile, The Edge of Memory by Patrick Nunn explores how oral traditions, much like knightly dictation, preserved knowledge across cultures, from Aboriginal songlines to medieval chronicles. Universities also hold clues. Cambridge's Parker Library hosts workshops on deciphering marginalia, where you can practice spotting a blind scribe's shorthand. Or join a seminar at Yale's Banach Library, where scholars debate whether the rhythmic phrasing in certain Crusader chronicles hints at oral dictation. Many of these institutions stream lectures online. Keep an eye out for titles like Voices in the Vellum or The Knight and the Quill. And if you crave hands-on immersion, consider a pilgrimage to Monte Cassino Abbey. Though rebuilt after World War II, its scriptorium replica lets you handle replica tools, wax tablets, pricked parchment, even a notched ruler like those blind scribes used. Run your fingers along the grooves and you'll feel history in a way no textbook can match. These aren't just relics, they're invitations to step into a world where limitations birthed genius, and where every manuscript holds a conversation between hands that couldn't see, voices that refused to stay silent, and a partnership that saved the past for our future. Let's tackle some of the biggest myths about these medieval partnerships head-on. First, the assumption that all blind scribes were monks. It's a persistent image, but history paints a messier, more fascinating picture. While monasteries were indeed hubs for scribble work, records from places like the Cathedral School of Chartres reveal blind lay scribes working alongside knights in secular courts. Take the case of Martin the Scribe, documented in the rolls of Elena of Aquitaine's court, a blind man paid not for copying scripture, but for transcribing troubadour poetry and legal contracts. His work, far from cloistered, pulsed with the politics and passions of the outside world. And let's not forget the Jewish scribes of Toledo, like Isaac ben Abraham, who collaborated with Christian knights to translate Arabic scientific texts, proving that these partnerships crossed religious lines long before modern interfaith dialogues. Now, to the knights, did they really care about books, or were they just funding scribes for prestige? The evidence speaks loudly. Look at the marginalia in the Morgan Crusader Bible, where a knight's handwritten note beside an illumination of battle reads, "This is how we fought at Jaffa, tell it true." This wasn't vanity, it was a visceral need to fix memory in ink. Or consider the Registrum of Eudes of Rouen, where a knight named Gautier de Chatelain is recorded paying a blind scribe extra to add medicinal recipes to his psalter, not for decoration, but because his wife suffered from joint pain. These weren't men who saw books as trophies, they were practical patrons who understood knowledge as survival. Another myth, that blind scribes merely copied texts verbatim, adding nothing original. Crack open the Silo's Apocalypse, and you'll find scribble interpolations like, "The beast's 7 heads may signify the 7 vices," as Sir Raymond noted in Acre. These weren't rote transcriptions but dynamic collaborations, where scribes synthesized a knight's battlefield theology with monastic scholarship. Even in administrative documents like the pipe rolls of Henry Roman II, blind scribes left their mark, literally. Their tactile signatures, pressed into wax with custom seals, often bore mottos like "Non vidimus sed simus," "We do not see, but we know." Perhaps the most stubborn misconception is that these partnerships were rare, eccentric exceptions. Tax records from Burgundy tell a different story. Lists of writing knights and blind notaries working in tandem across dozens of estates. A single ledger from 13th century Paris documents over 200 such collaborations, from legal disputes to love poetry. The scale wasn't marginal, it was systemic, a hidden engine of medieval intellectual life. So why does the myth of the solitary, sighted monk scribe persist? Partly because later Renaissance artists, crafting tidy images of scriptoria, airbrushed out the diversity of their predecessors, and partly because we've underestimated how disability could drive innovation rather than hinder it. These partnerships didn't happen despite blindness. They flourished because of the unique skills it fostered: acute memory, tactile precision, and a profound reliance on collaborative trust. As we close this chapter, remember that history's most enduring legacies often come from the alliances we least expect. The next time you hold a printed book or tap a screen, think of the centuries of voices and hands, some seen, some unseen, that made such wonders possible. Their story isn't just about the past, it's a blueprint for how difference can build bridges, one word at a time. Their story isn't just a relic of the past, it's a mirror reflecting urgent questions about how we value ability, collaboration, and resilience today. At its heart, the alliance between blind scribes and knights challenges a myth we've inherited: that progress is driven by solitary geniuses, not interdependent communities. Think of modern classrooms where students with disabilities are still often segregated, or workplaces where accommodations are framed as burdens rather than catalysts for innovation. The medieval scriptorium offers a radical counterpoint, a world where limitations sparked ingenuity, where the scribe's blindness wasn't overcome but harnessed, and where the knight's sword arm mattered less than his willingness to lend his voice. Consider how this reshapes our understanding of accessibility. Those tactile parchment guides and wax tablets weren't medieval workarounds, they were early assistive technologies, born from necessity but refined into art. Fast forward to today's screen readers or haptic feedback systems, and you'll spot the same principle. Tools designed with and for disabled users often end up benefiting everyone. Curb cuts, originally for wheelchairs, now ease life for parents with strollers and travelers with suitcases. Voice-to-text software, first aiding those who couldn't type, has become indispensable for busy professionals. The scribes and knights knew this truth instinctively, that designing for the margins lifts the center. Their legacy also reframes how we teach history. For centuries, their collaborations were erased or minimized, relegated to footnotes because they didn't fit the romanticized image of the lone, sighted monk or the illiterate warrior. Uncovering these stories does more than correct the record. It reveals how knowledge actually survives, through networks of diverse minds filling each other's gaps. Imagine applying that lens to other historical narratives. What if we highlighted Helen Keller's work with labor activists, not just her personal triumphs? Or centered the indigenous navigators who guided Lewis and Clark? The past becomes richer when we stop hunting for heroes and start mapping ecosystems. Perhaps most powerfully, their partnership models resilience for our fractured present. In an era of polarized discourse, we're steeped in zero-sum thinking, the idea that one group's gain requires another's loss. But the knight who funded a scribe's work didn't see it as charity. He knew his own legacy depended on their alliance. Today, initiatives like Denmark's Specialisten program, where autistic individuals thrive as tech consultants, or veteran-civilian dialogue projects echo that same wisdom. Difference isn't a weakness to tolerate, but a resource to cultivate. The lesson isn't that we should romanticize the Middle Ages. Their world was brutal, unequal, and far from perfect. But within its cracks, they nurtured a truth we're still relearning, that the future belongs not to the strongest or the sharpest-eyed. but to those who build bridges across the divides of ability, background, and belief. Their parchment may have yellowed, but their vision of a world where we don't just accommodate diversity, but rely on it feels more vital than ever. As we close this journey, don't just remember the scribes and knights as historical footnotes. See them as invitations to question who gets left out of our stories, to design tools that empower rather than exclude, and to forge alliances that might seem improbable today but could, centuries from now, be the ones that saved us all.